Hello. Welcome to a sentimental journey through history of John Allen's Gorre Daphetid Railroad. The Gorre Daphetid, Great Divide Division, a Class 1 railroad, model of steam era of the early 1930s. Its slogan, 76 slow scenic smiles through the Achenbach Mountains. A smile is a short scale mile. With 4% maximum grades, 107 bridges, 14 tunnels, 32-degree minimum curves, its prototypical elevation was from 3,000 to 6,000 feet. The Gorre Daphetid was situated in NMRA, California. Time for a short commercial. My name is Jerry Drake, and this scene is of the Giovanni Alleni Gorge on the Bend Spaghetti lines. The visual part of this program are slides, mostly photographed by me during my visits to John Allen's home. For the photography-minded, the camera is an Alpha, mostly using a 50mm Kearns White-Tar lens. Other slides used, credits will be given when viewed. The audio part is the catch. The only positive, authentic authority on the Gorre Daphetid is dead. Therefore, information is sketchy. It had to be from John Allen's magazine articles and the memories of the Gorre Daphetid operators and other friends. It is an impossible task to narrate all aspects of the great Gorre Daphetid in length and accuracy. I will try to touch on all subjects, but if by chance errors are made in narration, it probably was because my tongue got stuck on my eye tooth and I couldn't see what I was saying. For a newcomer, a short biography of John Allen. This slide was donated by Lynn Westcott of the Model Railroader magazine. John Whitby Allen was born in July 1913 in Missouri, was orphaned at an early age, and was raised by a relative in California. He graduated from the University of California, where part of his curriculum was the study of photography. He became a professional photographer, but he did some acting in front of the cameras, doing bit parts in the movies in the late 30s and early 40s. In 1943, he bought the Monterey Camera Studio in Monterey, California. His first article on model railroading was published in the July 1946 Model Railroader on how to make realistic model photos. He started the first Gorre Daphetid about 1947 in his home near Cannery Row. In 1953, he moved to the Monte Reggio section, and in the basement of his mountainside home built the present Gorre Daphetid. In January 1972, the Railroad Model Craftsman ran an article on the 25th anniversary of the railroad. John was a bachelor. On Saturday, January 6, 1973, John died of a heart condition that troubled him since a childhood illness. Wednesday, January 17, 1973, the Gorre Daphetid was lost to a fire with no known salvage of the railroad. This map depicts our walking tour of the railroad. We start at the Star, which is at the city of Port, then walk counterclockwise past the roundhouse and the engine facilities of Great Divide City and Cooper, then Cross Junction, around the peninsula of Gorre, the only part that was saved from the original railroad, around the Devil's Post pile to Daphetid, and then to Sowbelly and Angel's Camp. We then walk along Giant Canyon, where the scenery runs to the floor, to Devil's Gulch, and at Scalp, linger a while at Squaw Bottom, we'll marvel at Eagle's Nest, and wind up our tour at Andrews, across the canyon from Port. The numbered circles give the track height from the floor of the canyon, with 60 inches the highest at Cold Shoulder, Scalp, and Angel's Camp, with the lowest at Squaw Bottom at 30 inches. This map was taken from an excellent article in the March 1963 Model Railroader on the planning and concept of the Gorre Daphetid. Port, second largest city served by the G&D system. In August 1972, the background and the foreground scenery were almost completed. Note the curved linoleum backdrop, designed to hide the corner of the room. The industrial growth of the city is quite evident with the smoke and smog painted on the backdrop. The buildings along the backdrop are either flats or false fronts. These are mostly photographs that John, using his skill as a photographer, had taken of existing buildings on the layout and then reduced them to size to fit the dimensions needed. Others were cut out of magazines and glued to the backdrop. The buildings and factories were named for his friends, the Gorre Daphetid operators, and others. The brick factory at the right is for Joe Kane, a G&D operator. Also, the silver building is for Alan Fenton, an operator in the produce business. Back of it is the Port Union Station. Slightly to the left, the building with the gold dome is the Watson House, a hotel named for Waddy House, a model railroad friend. The Bowline Packers in the foreground is a franchise operation with branches in Los Angeles and Dallas, Texas. The corner building was aptly named Witt Towers, for Whitney K. Towers, the editor of the NMRA Bulletin, also well known as the president of the Alturas and Lone Pine Railroad. This building is of modular construction. John carved the pattern, made a latex mold of it. The modules were then cast in plaster. They were easily modified by cutting out a window for a door, with various window shades and curtains and the addition of some awnings. These modules were used throughout the entire layout on all sorts of buildings. The buildings next to Witt Towers was a photographic flat of a building made of the modules with a fire escape hung onto it. This slide and the previous one were taken in 1968, and the background was just being planned. Some of the buildings are just blank. The triangular tower building, the Port Railroad Station. Next to it is the corrugated iron building is Rosalie's Cannery, adjacent to Joe Kane & Sons factory. The silver building in the foreground, home of Fenton Produce, is in reality an access hole. The smokestacks and other visible objects were painted on the back side of the access hole to give the optical illusion of a large building. To the right of Rosalie's Cannery is a blank of a building. It is now Bruce Bowles' Boutade factory. Bruce Bowles is a G&D operator, but all research possible has not been able to define what is a boutade. The factory, now complete with cyclones, fire escapes, and windows, is a far cry from the blank seen in the previous slide. The smokestacks are dowels, cut in half, glued to the backdrop, and the smoke painted in. This 1969 slide shows many of the background buildings in the planning stages. In the right foreground is Port Plastics, Port's largest employer. The right-hand side is of the old plant made up of the modules. The new plant on the left is of concrete construction. Between the two plants is a mirror. The walkway connecting the two buildings hides the top of the mirror. The traveling crane is against the mirror. Only one half of it was modeled. The mirror gives it a full image. Coal was used in large amounts in the factory, so the gantry crane was designed to unload coal from both the river barges and railroad hoppers. Gorre and Daphetid Consolidation number 29 is slowly drifting into Great Divide yards. If the couplers seem unusual to you, they are Baker couplers, very seldom used today. Note the painters on the deck type worn truss bridge. It was a full-time occupation for painters on the bridges of the G&D. If you look down under the bridge, it will seem that all available space has been used. But here in 1972, 4 years later, we note quite a bit has been added to the area. A tug in the channel is in the background, is pushing oil and gasoline barges to the oil docks, and the painters are back repainting the bridge. In the foreground is the ship's railway servicing the boatyard. The tabs on the freight car roofs in the near foreground tracks are for this week's operation. There were 18 operations of switch at port, also the car ferry Annabelle. January 1970, the Model Railroader magazine ran a story authored by John on the operating procedures of the car ferry Annabelle. Time limits us to just skim the surface. In the next slide, we'll explain a little. Note the burned-out building in the background, behind the Cooper Electric Railway streetcar. This building was made of the modules, carved and painted the model of fire-gutted building. It was moved in 1969 to a better viewing location. In the foreground, you'll notice the board states temporary. This was to be replaced by a bascule-type lift bridge, and the operators, there were two of them who handled port's east and west cabs, were happy that it never was built, because when the Annabelle left port, the bridge would lift, thereby limiting the switching areas and slowing down the operation to more of a bottleneck than it was. We are looking down the track leads to the apron of the car ferry Annabelle. Note the yellow and black sign giving arrival and departure time of the ferry. It arrived at 12 noon, departed 5 p.m. Arrived again at 12 midnight, left at 5 a.m., limiting loading and unloading to 5-hour scale time, and at 10 to 1 it sometimes was a chore. It was originally planned to use 2 inches of water over a plastic base in the port area, but the humidity buildup was so great, so a 1/4 inch of casting resin was used instead. The elevated tower in the foreground was built by Jim Finley. In the lower left-hand corner, we see a little bit of the Expand-A-Lot. The Expand-A-Lot, the world's largest HO indoor parking lot. There were only 2 cars in the lot, but they were painted different colors on each half. There were 3 mirrors, 1 on each side and 1 in the rear, and just 1 light bulb. But by clever placement of the cars and mirrors in this 3-inch by 3-inch area, it would look like there were hundreds of cars and rows upon rows of lights. Non-reflective glass was used for the front. Therefore, the figure standing outside, their reflection is not visible in the glass. Just above the Expand-A-Lot is the roundhouse and locomotive facilities at Great Divide. The roundhouse was made of linoleum, carved and painted to resemble stone. John used linoleum extensively on the Gorre Daphetid, making stone viaducts, stone bridges, and retaining walls and other items of it. Note the very early locomotive on the middle foreground. To the left on the storage track is the G&D automobile conversion referred to as the ruptured duck. The engine servicing facilities, due to the mild climate, were outside. There were steam and air lines and electricity to each service track for minor maintenance. The Gorre Daphetid obtained these locomotives mostly second-hand and converted them to G&D specifications. John wrote a steam loco conversion quiz in the December 1970 RMC, using the G&D locomotives in the quiz. Let's list a few. The locomotive next to the roundhouse was an XGN 2662, a fairly new unit, started out as a C&O Malley, or Mallet, your choice. An Eastern Railroad Berkshire that was reworked, the largest rigid-frame locomotive on the system. Although John liked large articulateds and heavy 484s, he deliberately planned the railroad so only small articulateds and medium-sized engines would have clearance on curves and tunnels. The Sierra is an old favorite and an oil burner from the Santa Fe. John scratch-built a Mastodon 410 that had sound system in it. I am sorry, I have no photo of it. The railroad also had a gas-electric number 60 that we'll be seeing later in the series. There were no diesels on the railroad. The front of the roundhouse with its stable of fine passenger locomotives. The maroon tender belongs to Pacific number 56 that pulled the crack all-maroon dome streamliner. Again, being in a mild climate, doors were not necessary on the roundhouse. In the background is the Port Plastics factory. This shows its great size. Also, the mirror is quite evident. The large glaring object to the right of the factory is a prototypical window. Excuse it, please. But in 1969, I found out how to close the shutters. This 35mm wide-angle view shows the engine terminal in great detail. Wood towers match the corner of the room quite well. The rock outcropping in the foreground were made from tree bark, pressed into wet plaster, then colored with texture paints, and the addition of lichen and sawdust for grass. The center of attraction is the scratch-built rotary snowplow. Being a mountain railroad, Snow definitely was a problem. Information is lacking on just what the little gray shanty with the G&D Diamond Herald was used for. Maybe a portable comfort station. It is quite evident here the combination of tree bark and plaster and texture paint has a touch of realism. John had one word of caution on using tree bark in this method: look out for termites. Have you noticed so far that everything on the layout has been weathered so it all blends to the overall picture? A close-up view of the in-transit stock pens, the team track, part of the work train, focuses on the water tank. Its age is quite evident. We are at the end of the engine facilities and are at Austin Station in the city of Great Divide. The passengers and onlookers on the station platform are awaiting the morning passenger local just arriving at the station. Robinson's Foundry in the background was named for Cliff Robinson of Dallas, Texas. Passenger traffic has increased in 1972. The Cooper Electric Railway streetcar has stopped to let off a passenger. Just up the street is visible the theater marquee sign, the Orpheum. You can see the letters OR. The sign modeled the chase lights used on theater marquees in the 1920s and early 30s. The lights would go around the sign, and John modeled them very fully. Yes, that is part of a Revell kit next to the Orpheum, modified. Although John scratch built over 90% of the buildings on the railroad, he would and could use everything and anything that could be modified to suit the location. The West Divide Team and Transfer Building is a flat against the backdrop, pinned there temporarily. The pin is visible next to the Tioga Pass Freight Exchange, Jim Finley's railroad in Korea. The background buildings are mostly photos of existing buildings in port and magazine photos. No story on the Gorre Daphetid would be complete without comment on track work. Looking down the lead track to the turntable, we see the ash pit. This was fitted with a smoke generator. The rule was every coal-burning locomotive on arrival would stop on the pit, activating the smoke unit that simulated the dropping of ashes. The track was Code 70 nickel-silver rail, laid on individual wooden ties. The ballast was dyed sawdust. All turnouts were handmade in place. Note the double slip switch in the lower left-hand foreground. This John Allen photo shows the complexity of yard leads, slip switches, and three-way turnouts. The all-steel coaling tower goes back to 1946. John made it for his module used in the Model Railroad article magazine of that year. In the foreground is a Great Divide control panel. Two operators handle this cab, one on the makeup and breakup of trains, the other on the engine hostler. As I stated before, John Allen was an advocate of weathering. Note the variety of weathering on the cars. He wrote two articles on this subject, published in the Model Railroader, one in December 1955 and January 1956, on aging and weathering cars and locos. Annabelle's and Land's stores in the background were replaced in 1969 with the burned-out building we saw earlier in port. Note the traffic accident to the right of the building, where a car ran into a truck coming out of the driveway. Also the activity of the Cooper Electric track gang repairing the street. Did you spot the little diner in the rear of the building? On the street, next to the gutted building, we see the rear of a black truck, and just in front of it, a yellow truck. The truck has two rear ends. The front one is painted yellow. A mirror just in front of it creates this illusion. Crossing above the street is the High Line that was to be the final link of the main line from Angels Camp to the city of Great Divide. It was completed in December 1972. In the foreground is the caboose track at Great Divide Yards. Note the swayback combine. Just above it is visible the tunnel that is for the eastbound main line leaving Great Divide. To the left is the beginning of the freight and passenger yards. It is also our first view of the rock mold castings John used so extensively on the railroad. We're almost at the end of Great Divide, as the scenery is starting to curve to the left. The railroad modeled the early 1930s, but John would take exception to use a friend's car such as Leighton Keeling's Ulster Defactory plug-door box. Notice again the great variety of weathering. In the left background is Great Divide passenger station is almost complete. It is against the mirror. Adjacent to the station is the domed maroon streamliner. We're a little bit closer to the passenger terminal at Great Divide City, and the mirror is quite evident. In fact, the Superior Baking sign is reflected in the mirror. Backwards, of course. In the foreground yard tracks is an old stock car, the well-weathered tank car, and a sway-back watermelon car. We'll see it a little later on. The pier in the middle foreground was to carry the girder bridges that were to carry the westbound main out of Great Divide. There is a lot to see in this 1972 slide, so let's start at the upper right background. Although the mirror was not noticeable too easy by the naked eye, the camera picks up things a little differently. Therefore, it is quite evident here. The station and passenger platforms were completed, and the pride of the G&D, the streamliner, is back from another run. Next to the mirror is a building with a large clock on it. This is the scale time clock that was visible to all 9 operators in the room. All scheduled operations were based on this time clock. John Allen wrote 2 articles on scale time. January 1966 in the Model Railroader, Why Use Scale Time? In March 1966, Scale Clock Operation. These articles explain the use of scale time in model railroad operations very fully. I asked the Gorre Daphetid operators, how did John govern the speed of the clock, and what problems did it cause, if any? On one of their operating sessions, they sent me this answer.
All right, Jerry, here we go now on the fast clock. John's little trick that he would play on the operators. We never did know what he did to the mechanism in the thing, but he had it set up that he could vary the rate of this clock all the way from 6 to 1 to 12 to 1. And if we got proficient and paid attention to what we were doing, he would speed the clock up slightly on us, and we weren't so doggone smart the next week. Or if we were having problems in a certain area, traffic would pile up or something, he could very easily slow it down, and we still stay on his schedules, his time schedules.
On the street next to the clock building, the diorama technique was used on modeling of the cars parked at the curb. Each car diminishes in size as it goes up the hill to give the illusion of distance. Cross Junction at the lower level, and Corsa, named for Bill Corsa, a G&D operator, on the upper level. This John Allen design was built by Jim Finley, and an article on how to construct the station was published in the May 1968 Model Railroader. It was authored by Jim with photographs by John. Note the hand-operated train order boards. The signal is set for a pickup of train orders for both the engine and conductor crews. The train order hoops are at the center of the station platform. There was no centralized traffic control, commonly called CTC, or automatic block signaling system on the Gorre Daphetid. Just train orders and time clock operation. This Jim Gibson slide shows the station lit up at night. In the foreground is the swayback ventilated reefer. Note the individual boards in the roof construction. The Baker couplers are quite visible here. The glare under the couplers is the reflection of the plastic uncoupling ramp that were solenoid operated. A nice modeling touch are the posters on the ancient fence. The logging operation at Sow Belly Creek. The water in the creek is casting resin. Most of the tall timber has been cut in this area. The small trees in the middle ground area were made in an unusual method. Native twigs, such as sagebrush, were dipped in glue, then dusted with canceled check clippings, courtesy Bank of America. The multicolored clippings would give an appearance of blossoming trees, or they could be spray painted for the tree desired. In 1972, the area has not changed. The stone viaducts were made of carved linoleum and painted. The trees show up very well in this photo. We raised the sights of our camera looking up Sawbelly Creek. Angel's Camp is on the hilltop. Under the Warren Truss Bridge is the route of the narrow-gauge Devil's Gulch and Hellengaun Railroad. The rail has not been laid as yet. The terminus for the DG&H was in Gorre. The Devil's Post pile dominates the scene at Gorre. This great pile of red and gray granite was made to hide a support post. In the left background is Cold Shoulder, high up in the snow area. To the right is Devil's Gulch, and to the right of the post pile, at the base of it, is Butler Mine, and across Taylor Lake is the town of Daphetid, reached by a switchback from Butler Mine. The tracks are visible in the foreground. This peninsula was the only part saved of the original G&D and was used to start the present railroad in 1953. The rail here was brass, and this caused some electrical pickup problems, so the use of many track cleaning cars were a necessity. Also, with 15-inch radius curves and a 4 to 6% grades, short wheelbase or geared locomotives handled the switching chores at Gorre. The industrial section of Gorre, the stock pens, the oil depot, the tin-roofed building with the roof ventilators, is the Purina Chow's feed mill. In the foreground are two of the 4 control panels at Gorre. They were the 2 mainline cabs, the Peddler Freight cab, and the Gorre and Daphetid branch line cab. Power for the throttles was supplied by Variacs, but there were 2 cabs that had different throttles. One was a Variac that was controlled by a DC geared motor. 2 sets of double-pole, double-throw switches comprised the controls. One set controlled track direction, with the center off as a panic button. The other controlled the acceleration and deceleration of the Variac. When the reduction gear-driven Variac reached the speed desired, the switch was turned to the off position. To decelerate, the motor was reversed. It took some time for the locomotive engineer to stop accurately, and a lot of operating time was necessary to gauge the stops at stations and uncoupling ramps. The other, a momentum throttle, an ingenious contraption of a motor-generator combination. A DC motor, rheostat-controlled, drove a 5-pound flywheel that was coupled to a DC generator. It had 2 ammeters, one showing input to the DC motor, the other showing output of the generator. He also had an electrical watt meter, the type that measures the wattage use in your home, as a water meter. This was hooked up to the input motor leads, and the engineer had to watch the ammeter and the water meter. Water stops were a must in operations, so if the engineer was a throttle jockey and used too much power to drive the train, he was also using up his water in the tender. If he got too low, he would have to drop his train, travel light to the next water, and then pick up his train. Needless to say, this throttle was not used too often on operating nights. It was mainly used for visiting engineers who wanted to run a train on the G&D. The wood truss bridge carries the branch line to Butler Mine and also serves as a link in the switchback to Daphetid. In the middle foreground at the 3-way switch is a ground throw. Ground throws were used wherever possible. Otherwise, rotary switch machines controlled turnouts. In this view, it seems that the backdrop and Daphetid are all one scene, but there's an aisle halfway between the two. Note the burned-out wood building at Daphetid. The time-worn gondola in the foreground was plastic. Heat was applied to make the bulges in the panels, as an old prototypical gon would look. Just beyond the 060 switcher, number 12, that handled the switching chores in this area, is the narrow gauge interchange for the Devil's Gulch and Helen Gone Railroad. The engine facilities were in the two-stall engine house just at the base of the Devil's Post pile. In 1948, John Allen entered the engine house in the Model Railroader magazine's National Model Contest. In those years, the Model Railroader and not the NMRA ran the contest. Its entry caused a bit of controversy. John's prototypical modeling of the engine house, resplendent with pigeons, pigeon droppings, broken windows, and extensive weathering, was a far cry from the typical entries of the day, mostly inanimate, toy-like modeling of structures. Although John did not originate weathering or animation, the models winning Best of the Show helped to speed the trend of today's excellent modeling and lifelike and realistic model railroad layouts. The water tank in back of the engine house is by Jim Finley. An article by him in October '65 Model Railroader entitled A Branch Line Water Tank explains how it was built. The stone walkway in front of the station was gray felt building paper with bits of stone-colored paper glued to it. The post pile was a hard-shell construction, then finished with carved and formed plaster. Before going around the Devil's Post pile, let's look back at Fort and Great Divide. In this 24-millimeter wide-angle lens picture, they look like adjacent cities, although schematically they are many miles apart. John thought the 24-millimeter lens was not suited to layout photography because its scope was too great and too much objectionable material would be caught by the camera. He was right, because that large tube in the right of the picture is the cable release. Shooting at f/22 at 32 seconds requires a vibrationless cable shutter release, and there it is, big as life. This John Allen slide has just caught the G&D rail car, the Ruptured Duck, on one of its periodic rail inspection tours, just rounding the post pile. John also took this slide of 10-wheeler number 49, heading the morning passenger local, very slowly crossing the highest wood trestle on the railroad. The tallest bent is over 125 feet. The trestle spans Ryan's Gulch. Just through the tunnel, in the Devil's Post pile, is Gorre. Just above Ryan's Gulch, which was named for Bill Ryan, founder of Pacific Fast Mail, is the town of Daphetid. On the team track is the Schwarzschild und Sulzberger Reefer. This was a track cleaning car. As this part of the layout was a bit dark, the underbody detail and track cleaning apparatus is not visible. John illuminated his layout with photography in mind, using a light meter system in the placement of lights. Also, as in real life, some parts of the canyons would be darker than others. He used incandescent light bulbs as the main lights and fluorescent tubes as an addition for the daylight effect and to give this effect in color photography. He also used blacklight for effect in night scenes. We'll see a slide of blacklight at Andrews. The track in the left foreground is the main line to Gorre. The first tunnel carries the branch line to Daphetid. The second is the abandoned branch line. To clarify how the track cleaning cars were made, here are two from the bench spaghetti lines. A rectangular piece of untempered masonite, 2 1/4 times 1 1/4 times 1/8 thick, rough side down, with the leading edges beveled to give it a sled-like action. To keep it from hanging up on switch points is the scrubber. 2 finish nails press-fitted in the masonite and a very loose fit in the car body so the cleaner can rise and fall with the rail complete the cleaner. By painting the cleaner a dark color, it will be less conspicuous, as seen under the black Denver and Rio Grande Western boxcar. On the Gorre and Daphetid line, these cars were used as any revenue-producing car on every session, and they were very effective in dust control. The station at Daphetid, built by Jim Finley from photos taken by John Allen. It modeled the station at Spreckles, California. Jim wrote a two-part story on its construction in the November and December 1966 model railroader. It was made of balsa and brick paper. Note the arched windows and posters. The fire engine just finished putting out a fire at Gorre Daphetid's fire extinguisher factory. Gorre Daphetid is the retired fire chief of Monterey, a touch of John's humor. To model a fire-ravaged wood building, each piece of wood has to be carved and painted and then assembled to give the overall picture of a real fire. We are now in Giant Canyon at the Second Star, at Sowbelly Station and Angels Camp. The rail line with the splines running from one side was to take the narrow gauge Devil's Gulch and Helen Railroad. It joined the main line at Sowbelly, where the splines run across, and was dual gauged just before Helen Gap. There it left the main line, was to make a return loop and go back to Gorre. It never was completed on the present layout. The scenery goes from floor to ceiling, and the floor was painted to simulate a large, muddy river. Sowbelly Station on the lower level is on the main line from Gorre. It had a house and team track. Note the wood siding extension, left over from the old bridge. This enabled the peddler freight engineer to bring his engine and one car onto the team track. The small control panel in the right foreground controlled this area. By 1972, oil was getting in great demand, so more storage tracks were added. The stone retaining walls were carved and painted plaster. The ivy growing on them was made of colored string for the vines and colored sawdust for leaves. Angels Camp, a diorama 60 inches long by 8 inches deep, from the edge of the retaining wall to the backdrop. Jim's barbershop and the other foreground buildings were tridimensional. The others were false fronts and photos glued to the backdrop. Note the well-weathered combine, number 4 of the narrow gauge railroad. The track up here was standard gauge, and as this line was not completed, John kept his narrow gauge rolling stock up here out of harm's way. This small station and tower combination was replaced in 1970 with this larger combination. Note the witch's hat roof on the tower, a John Allen creation. The vintage or the prototype of the narrow gauge 240 tank locomotive is unknown, but John even modeled a set of deer antlers on the headlight of the old number 3 spot. I wonder just how many head of longhorn cattle that swayback stock car carried. French Gulch. We are entering the mountainous section of the railroad, and this scene at French's is the first example of vertical separation. A couple of $76 words for gullies, ravines, dry washes, etc. Soon there will be many examples of this technique till we reach the town of Andrews. Here also the scenery rises from canyon floor to the sky, so to speak. The wooden truss bridge is the largest wood span on the pike. It measures a scale 175 feet long. On this steep mountainside, the 4 tracks of the single-track main line pass near each other as the track winds back and forth to gain elevation. The distance from the wood siding extension to the backdrop, seen above and through the arch of the stone bridge, is less than 2 feet. Note the drainage pipes in the retaining wall with plastic water dripping. At the left, just above the second level of track. Seen here at the center of the picture, the girder bridge jutting out in the canyon is the approach for the final span that was to link Scalp to Angels Camp. Here the use of dry washes makes a much larger area. Note the surveyors on the bridge. The transit man is sighting across the canyon to the rod man, just barely visible on the top of Scalp Mountain. The 24mm wide-angle lens shows the great distance to be spanned by the planned steel arch bridge. In the upper left background is the town of Aiken. Seen behind Scalp Mountain in the Achenbach Mountains. This is Devil's Gulch. The area here was excavated to approximately what John was planning. Then concrete was poured over the excavated earth. Then plaster, rock molds, and carved plaster, with a final touch of trees and vegetation. As it was necessary for maintenance purposes to walk in this area, scenery was kept to a minimum. We are at the same spot, but switched back to a 50mm lens. The curved girder bridge on the left is Sims Loop, across the gulch. Note the reddish coloration of the cliff face. In the background center of the gulch is barely visible the town of Nika. As we are guests and don't want to walk into Devil's Gulch, we'll use a telephoto lens for a better view of Nika. Here John used the largest mirror, 6 foot long, and you are correct. Nika is the mirror image of Aachen, seen in an earlier slide. The mirror is not visible in this slide, but by moving our camera a degree or so, we have lost the image of Nika, but we can see where the mirror begins. At the upper left, just above the fire-damaged forest. The clouds are partly painted on the mirror and partly on the backdrop. It starts there and goes for 6 feet. The forest fire was started by a careless smoker. And the pine trees at the right were made from a variety of materials. Balsa or cedar shingles were rounded and tapered, roughened with a file to simulate bark, and painted. Holes were then drilled into the trunks using asparagus fern, goldenrod, and other types of vegetation for branches and foliage. Note the great variety of color in the evergreens. Robinson's Cliff is the name of this spectacular pile of stone back of Squaw Mountain, and it was named for Cliff Robinson. Naturally, Squaw Bottom Creek wends its way through the bottom of Devil's Gulch to empty in the Giant Canyon River. The water here was plastic, but real water, the H2O stuff, would occasionally flow through the creek. It would originate at the log pound at Andrews and flow down the creek to empty into a floor drain in Giant Canyon. Lonesome George the Rodman is still up there on the top of Scalp Mountain. Scalp Mountain served a twofold purpose. Besides being the stepping stone for the 2 large bridges spanning the canyon, the main line made a complete circle around and through it to gain elevation. This high curved girder bridge on the edge of Grand Cliff was also on a 4% grade, and the engineer traversing this part of Sims Loop was very careful to follow the rule of very slow orders. In the lower right is barely visible the floor drain in which the water would drain from Squaw Bottom Creek. Sims Loop was also on a 26-inch radius curve, the tightest on the main line. Inside the loop is the Squaw Bottom Cinnabar Mine. This mine was one of the many automated items on the railroad. The mine was built by John Allen, with Jim Finley helping on the automation of the hopper car. The hopper would come out of the mine tunnel, approach the tipple, dump the ore, and go back empty. It would reappear in a minute or two and repeat the performance. The hopper had 2 tops, one filled with ore, the other empty. It would approach the end of the tipple. A magnet would trip the hopper, and it would then appear to be empty. Returning in the mine, the magnet there would return it to the full position. A large eccentric inside Scalp Mountain controlled the back and forward travel of the car. We are now at the 3rd star at Squaw Bottom on our final turn of this trip through Giant Canyon. Cold Shoulder, Eagle's Nest, Hellengone Gap, and Andrews remain. Squaw Bottom Station as it appeared in 1968. Here the main line reached the lowest level on the railroad at 30 inches. In 1969, a larger station was built for Squaw Bottom, another joint work by Allen and Finley. There is an interesting bit of prototypical practice in the detail of the dual-gauge trackage on the right of the way, blasted out of the side of the cliff just above Squaw Bottom Creek. Note the short tunnel, left here to give support to the rock face, in order to cut down on rock slides. It is to be noted that by careful engineering, there never was a wreck on the G&D due to a rock slide. In 1972, it had a look of permanence. A new industry, a chemical plant, is across the tracks from the station. High in the mountains is Aiken. Here again the diorama technique. The side walls of the buildings were foreshortened to give the perspective of distance. The freight cars in the yard in back of the town were built to the size of TT scale. Again, note the short tunnel. Boring through granite, it was not necessary to have portals or shoring. This spectacular view of the steel arch bridge spanning Devil's Gulch that linked Cold Shoulder at the left with Scalp at the right, the view through the arch to the scenery in the backdrop seems to go on forever. In January 1972, John sent me this slide, telling me he had just finished the smaller of the two arch bridges that were to complete the main line between Cold Shoulder and Angels Camp. The many hours of labor, he wrote, took the edge out of bridge building, for a while anyway. But what endears this photo to me is that he took the time to include in the train two of my railroad cars, the steel blue-green box with the orange door and the red meatball for the bench spaghetti lines, and the white tank car with the red domes from the Capuzza Gas Company. For you who don't understand Italian-American slang, Capuzza means what stinks. To be polite, that is. This graceful bridge combination of stone arch, girder, and truss was aptly called High Bridge. In the background, Cold Shoulder is just above High Bridge and was in the process of being built in 1968. Note at the base of High Bridge the stone abutment. Here is where the narrow-gauge Devil's Gulch and Hellengone Railroad was to leave the main line of the G&D trackage and proceed to Hellengone Gap. Cold Shoulder, up above the snow line, was a mecca for skiers. Note the rotary snowplow, ready for the next snowfall. Even the sky looks frigid here. Note the enclosed water tank. Now follow the track across the stone viaduct, all the way to the left. You will see it again in one of the best placed mirrors used on the layout. Looking under High Bridge to the snow line, the snow here was texture paint, using the zip texture method of sprinkling a mixture of dry paint and plaster over a pre-wetted surface to give the appearance of fresh fallen snow. Eagle's Nest, the restaurant with a view. From its porch steps, the Aikenback Mountains, Giant Canyon, Cold Shoulder, Andrews, and Hellengone Gap could be seen in all their scenic beauty. In 1968, none of the background scenery was in. Cold Shoulder is just taking shape with a hardshell mountain in the upper right. Still in 1968, this view is toward Andrews. In the far left is visible the final mirror on the layout, reflecting part of the unfinished scenery at Andrews. Note the gas electric number 60, just to the right of Eagle's Nest. This combine played the lead part of a two-part story in the Railroad Model Craftsman magazine, March and April 1971 issues, titled The RMC's Fan Trip on the Gorre Daphetid. This pinnacle of red and gray granite was a ruse to hide another support post that kept John's living room floor from falling into the layout. John had some interesting photos with the story 45 Minutes at Eagle's Nest in the August 1967 Model Railroader magazine. The great amount of scenic detail made this slide a must. The blending of rock, grass, and trees to create a gentle mountain meadow is to me a fine example of perfect modeling art. In the lower left is the main line of Squaw Bottom. Just above the track, slightly to the right, the roadbed is being cleared for the Devil's Gulch and Hellengone Narrow Gauge Railroad. A close-up view of the lift facilities at Eagle's Nest. This was another automated model on the layout. The lift was raised and lowered by cables, powered by a winch, driven by a one-cylinder donkey engine, with the upright boiler supplying steam. It took 90 seconds to reach the top and 60 seconds to descend. A reversible motor under the layout controlled the cables, with limit switches stopping the up and down travel. The rock below the track was made by dipping strips of paper into molding plaster and formed to simulate the vertical strata of the red rock. Rock molds and carved plaster was used for the gray granite needle. In the background is a floor furnace that malfunctioned and caused a fire that destroyed this beautiful work of art. Helen Gone Gap. Crossing the curved chord worn deck-type truss bridge is the famous Gorre Daphetid tourist and railfan train, powered by an ancient American 440. It is on the branch line to Andrews. The main line curved off through the rock needle and goes to Cold Shoulder. John used all sorts of material for his bridges: wood, paper, linoleum, metal, Strathmore board, plaster, and etc. And no two of the 107 bridges were exactly alike. The black granite cliff was made to hide a small alcove between Helen Gone Gap and Andrews. Hard shell and rock molds were the modeling method. Perhaps in your travels around the country you might have noticed the gleam and sparkle in some of the rock cliffs. My knowledge of geology is low, so I cannot be definite. Granite most likely. John simulated this by gently blowing mica dust on the fresh-painted cliff after it dried, and it would gleam as does the prototype. The camera does not pick it up. The time exposure shows some of the gleam as just white dots. The building on top is a photograph touched up for effect. Down at the lower right foreground, just at the edge of the cliff, are the falls at Helen Gone Gap. These were plastic, but as we said before, real water would run down the falls from the log pond in Andrews on exhibition nights. In 1972, the scenery at Andrews was named for Andrew Allen, John's brother, was almost complete. The Black Mountain has been fully scenic with lichen and other vegetation. The caboose is just about to enter the tunnel. This track curved and climbed and joined the main line just before Cold Shoulder. In the foreground is Andrews Creek. Note the attention that was paid to scenery detail on the creek banks. Andrews was first known for its hot springs, and the therapeutic waters brought many people to the spa at the Westward Ho. Traffic got so heavy the station had to be enlarged, so the original wood building was jacked up and a larger brick addition was built under it. There's a lot of activity in this small village of Andrews. The operator who handled this cab had his hands full. In the middle foreground, a pony cart driver got too close to the edge of the ravine and his cart slipped into the Andrews Creek. He is down there trying to figure out how to get it back up with a bit of vocal assistance from the kibitzer on the bank. John Allen, when he started in the hobby back in 1946, there weren't too many commercial figures of humans or animals available, so he made his own. This close-up view of the track workers at Great Divide shows them a little clearer. They were made with a soft wire armature for the skeleton, but really for strength. A soft wax was daubed on, hardened, and then carved to suit. They were then dipped in a shoe milk, a liquid shoe polish, as a primer, because oil or water paint won't adhere to wax, and then painted to suit. After the advent of finer commercial figures, John started to use them instead. This is a John Allen photo. We are at the center of town. Remember at Port we had the Watson House? Well, here at Andrews we have the Westward Ho House. The diorama perspective technique is quite evident here, with the steep slope of the street ending at the mirror. I believe that perhaps the placement of the camera gives the out-of-plumb reflection of the Westward Ho in the mirror. The Lemming Compressed Gas Company was built by Jim Finley. The prototype is in Dallas, Texas. Note the ancient tank loco that was mounted on a cement platform, and to the right of it is a 3-story building made of the modules housing Lynn's archives. It reads, Ancient Manuscripts, Literature, and Altered Articles. I don't see how Lynn Westcott got so many magazines printed out of such a small shop. The use of blacklight and fluorescent paint does enhance this night scene at Andrews. Note the westward ho sign. The blacklight gives it a luminous quality of neon lights. This is one half of a stereo slide taken by Philip Sternberg of California. Looking back towards the right background, note how the westward ho hides the corner of the room, as does the Peterson feed mill. The background has not been completed as yet, so the profile technique method shows up by using only one half of the round silos. The detritus product stamp mill, with its buckets that could be automated, was an early Jim Finley creation. To save time looking up in your Funk and Wagnalls, the definition of detritus is any disintegrated matter or debris or ore. The logs on the foreground tracks are on their way to the sawmill just up the tracks. Visible here at the left, the mill is placed against a mirror, doubling its size. In the left background is the Andrews branch of Allen Fenton's Produce Company. The small sign on top proclaims it to be the broccoli capital of the world. Next to it is a small junkyard named for Earl Flaws, who was also postmaster of Andrews, a Gorre and Daphetid operator. Although John Allen was best known for his many published articles on the science and mathematics of model railroading, he truly believed in the NMRA slogan that model railroading is fun, and had a great sense of humor, as evident by the name of the railroad, the names of the industries and towns, and relished playing a trick on a friend, like the time he obtained a laugh box, the type that has a laugh track recorded on it, that could be activated by electrical contact. He hooked it up to a turnout control at a very busy cab, and when their operator threw the switch, activating the laugh box, he got shook up by the laughter, not only from the box. Also in material objects, such as this work Bronto, being used here as a log skidder, and of course, as in prototype practice, it carried a number. John carved this, and also the longhorn steers, whose curiosity the dyno aroused. Just at the base of the right-hand girder of the truss bridge is visible the leg of another dinosaur, seen here before the area was fully scenic. When some aghast visitor would fall into the trap and say, "What is that dinosaur doing there?" John would say, "It lives there." Yeah, I fell for it. The compressed space factory was a fully automated mirror-walled factory. For those too far back to read the text on the signs, they are as follows from top to bottom. Compressed space limited. Expandable space, sold by the barrel or carload. It has the NMRA seal of approval. The large notice reads, "We make a lot out of a little. Solve your layout space needs. See dozens of machines at work compressing space for model railroaders. With one barrel of compressed space, you can build a giant railroad empire in a small closet. At the left is a switch worded 'Hold down for action,' and by looking into the eyepiece that magnifies the view, you could see many, many machines at work." In the early days of the hobby, he exchanged passes. This pass was reproduced photographically. The pass, and also the copy of John's early letterhead, was loaned by Bill McClanahan from Dallas, Texas. The original colorful letterhead on the right-hand side had a different slogan. It was, "We ain't modern, but we're progressive." On the left is the present letterhead John used with the schematic drawings of the railroad. He also created his own stamp, a fairly new item, using rub-ons. Seen a little clearer in this slide. The G&D stamp in orange. The other one is the legal one. It reads, 2 cents, NMRA States of America. The front end of an old wood burner with the G&D initials on the left and the NMRA Herald on the right. Gorre Daphetid on the ribbon. It states, "Land of HO." In 1968, at the NMRA convention in San Francisco, John told me he was advertising our restaurant, that is Terry and Jerry's O Solomeo restaurant, in a 16 by 20-foot billboard. He said it was in port, but would not tell me where. I spent the better part of 4 days trying to find it, and I never could. Later, John sent me a letter with a triangle drawn on it as a clue, and I found it in every slide taken of port since. In 1969, I took this telephoto shot of it. Oh, it's right behind the triangular tower at Port Station, on the wall of the building. Operating sessions on the Gorre Daphetid were run as a prototypical railroad operation, and a full 24 hours comprised of a session. At 10 to 1, it would run about 2¼ hours. The day and night sequences in every 24-hour day were controlled by a large relay setup that would very slowly turn down the room lights and turn on the various lights in the homes, factories, and street lights. In this slide, it looks romantic. But notice here, in Great Divide, at twilight, it's still fairly easy to see. Still a little faint light in the sky. Now it is deep night. Imagine trying to keep up schedules in darkness with nothing but train lights and building and street lights to see where you're at. The operators finally bought some very tiny pen lights and told John they were switchman's lanterns, or I should say brakeman's lanterns, so they could at least read the tabs on the car roofs. John once in a while would stop the sequence and would run in darkness. He enjoyed the turmoil it caused so much. He sent the operators Christmas cards and signed them the Nightmaker. The slides used in the night scenes were taken from John Allen's tape slide clinic, Scenery and Layout Photography, number 780-23. This slide reads Photography and Lighting Model Railroads, but they are the same clinic. The 1969 production shows many detailed close-ups of the Gorre Daphetid. He also authored another clinic, Optimum Use of Space. John analyzed in detail on how to use every available inch of space for your railroad. Also, he shows the use and placement of mirrors and access holes. In 1972, the latest innovation in model railroading were sound systems, and John had 2 different types in his locomotives, and we corresponded about them via tapes. I would like to have you hear a little of what he sent me on his system. The tape is a bit noisy at times because it is difficult to be sound engineer, narrator, railroad engineer, and whistleblower all at the same time.
Hi, Jerry. This is John Allen. I'm very interested in your tape with the good and bad things on the PFM sound system. I, of course, have no bell, but I do have a whistle, which, of course, is installed under the railroad, and I will blow it. It's not as good as the PFM one, but it does the job pretty well, and all cabs have one, although it's under the railroad, and we do use it for operation, for the crossing and coming to yards with different codes. I'll run an engine and blow the bell while it's going, and maybe it'll sound a little better.
The whistle and the voice are forever still. This presentation could not have been possible without the great help and patience of the Gorre Daphetid operators in general, and Alan Fenton and Joe Kane in particular, in answering my constant questions. Also Lynn Westcott for his loan of the photographic portrait of John Allen, and the editors of the Railroad Model Craftsman, the Model Railroader, and the NMRA Bulletin in publishing the John Allen articles. And last but not least, thank you for joining me in our tour of one of the finest model railroads ever created by one man, John Allen